Hello, everybody. How are you? Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Hi, Lana. Lana says hola tonight. Hi, Gina Marie. Nice to see you again. Uh, a few others are here also, but I cannot see who they are yet. Okay, the minimum wage. So the minimum wage is coming back. Evidently, the Democrats are not giving up on it yet. Maybe they won't give up on it. We have a number of indications of that. We'll pick up these indications as we go through some articles on the subject. So let me begin to access some of those for you. First was an interesting post from the Daily Poster. Post from the Daily Poster sounds a bit redundant, doesn't it? Turns out a fast food giant is claiming credit for killing the $15 an hour minimum wage. This piece is by Walker Bragman, Andrew Perez, and Dave Sirota on March 26th. And the parent company of some of America's largest fast food chains is claiming credit for convincing Congress to exclude a minimum $15 an hour minimum wage from the recent COVID bill, according to internal company documents reviewed by the Daily Poster. I guess the Daily Poster got a leak from the company. The company, which is owned by a private equity firm named after an Ayn Rand character, Howard Rourke, in particular from The Fountainhead, also says it is now working to thwart new union rights legislation. This comes just a few months after a government report found that some of its chains had among the highest percentage of workers relying on food stamps. Inspire Brands, which owns Jimmy John's, Arby's, Sonic, and Buffalo Wild Wings, plus recently acquired Dunkin' Donuts for $11.3 billion in November. On Thursday, sent employees and franchisees a review of its government lobbying activity that highlighted its success in keeping the $15 an hour minimum wage out of Democrats' American Rescue Plan. The bill Joe Biden signed earlier this month. We were successful, this is a quote, we were successful in our advocacy efforts to remove the Raise the Wage Act, which would have increased the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour and eliminated the tip credit, unquote, reads the report. Further down, the report notes the company's ongoing lobbying campaign in the Senate against the PRO Act, which recently passed the House and contains a laundry list of organized labor's goals, such as eliminating right-to-work laws and banning mandatory company sponsored meetings that are designed to discourage the union activity. Quote, under this proposed rule, franchisors could be considered the direct employer of the franchise owners in their system, as well as the restaurant workers those owners employ, taking away the independence of small business owners, unquote. The document said. Quote, you get the impression they're actively spitting in our eyes, saying, quote, yes, we work to suppress wages of our employees, and we're just going to brazenly tell you, unquote. One Inspire Brands worker told the Daily Poster, quote, I really do think that a line was crossed. You're just going to brazenly tell your employees, quote again, not only did we work to kill wages, but going forward, we're also going to make sure the PRO Act doesn't pass either, unquote. So the Daily Poster asked Inspire Brands to respond with a comment, and they have not immediately done so. The article goes through some more background, but basically the point is this company is simply outrageous in its opposition to the minimum wage, raising the minimum wage, and outrageous in its opposition to the PRO Act, as well. In the year before, Inspire acquired his company. Dunkin' Brands CEO was paid millions and then made millions more when the deal closed. Also, while paying many of its workers below $15 an hour, Inspire Brands franchises are generating $26 billion in annual revenue and enriching top executives. The founder of Jimmy John's, which has been accused of busting worker union drives, recently boasted on his website that he was named one of the planet's wealthiest men. In government filings that year, Dunkin' Brands warned investors about the prospect of low-wage workers being paid better. And quote, our name signifies our admiration for the qualities embodied by Howard Rourke, who's a character from The Fountainhead. Inspire Brands is majority owned by Rourke Capital, a $23 billion private equity giant named after the self-centered protagonist of The Fountainhead, the novel by Ayn Rand, which is considered a foundational conservative text for the defense of billionaires and economic inequality. So the article goes on and on, but basically there it is, the arrogance of a giant private equity company that's got billionaires in it, but completely unwilling to pay workers even close to a living wage, because as we know, even $15 an hour today would not be a living wage in many, many areas of the United States. But they don't care. They have their billions, of course. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, there are other sentiments. Specifically, in this piece, I picked up from reader-supported news, but which is out of The Guardian, dated 29th of March, 2021. An author by the name, Valoran Aratani, headlines her article, quote, "You will not have your seat again," unquote. How the fight for $15 an hour movement gained new momentum. For Terrence Wise, a McDonald's employee from Kansas City, Missouri, the battle for a raise in the federal minimum wage is far from over. Joe Biden campaigned on a raise, the first since 2009, and the majority of Americans of both parties support an increase. And yet last month, Congress blocked an increase from the paltry $7.25 an hour, where it has been stuck since 2009. Now there are signs of new momentum for change. If Washington can't find a solution, Wise had a warning for politicians of both sides. Quote, if you're not going to make $15 an hour, if you're not going to make it a reality for workers, if you're not going to create an environment for workers to join a union and make that possible, you will not be reelected. You will not have your seat again, unquote, Wise said, an organizer with the Fight for 15 movement. Quote, we will not continue to choose the representatives who are truly not representing us or who are out of tune with the working class. Quote, we say, don't take it as a threat, take it as a promise, unquote. High hopes that the federal minimum wage would be lifted for the first time in over 10 years came with the introduction of Biden's stimulus package. The wage hike which Biden tucked into his original stimulus plan would have been the largest victory for the Fight for $15 movement since it started to mobilize fast food workers in 2012. But when the bill hit the Senate, the wage increase faced two major hurdles. The moderate Democrats, who said that $15 an hour was just too high, and a ruling from the Senate's parliamentarian on whether including an increase in the spending bill would break the Senate rules. Ultimately, both factors stopped the increase from going into law. I'm not sure I like the framing of that. Okay, entirely, yes, both of these were a factor. Okay, but also, something else was a factor, and that was the unwillingness of Biden to fight to keep the minimum wage bill in. Biden was evidently unwilling to have the issue of the parliamentarian actually brought up in the form of a point of order to Harris, okay, to Vice President Harris, who could have voted on the stimulus package with the minimum wage bill in it. But evidently, Biden didn't want to have that happen, didn't want to have himself and Harris on the line for that. So he and Chuck Schumer planned for Chuck to amend the House bill before it got a vote on the Senate floor to take the minimum wage bill out of it. Bernie Sanders then was put in the position of either saying no to the $1.9 trillion stimulus package or trying to get the minimum wage bill back into the package by trying to amend it. He chose the latter course. He didn't want to sacrifice the stimulus package or risk its sacrifice. He didn't take a tough position with Chuck Schumer and say, I will not vote for this bill if it doesn't have the minimum wage in it. And so what happened was he faced a situation, Bernie Sanders did, where he needed to get 60 votes to get the amendment for the minimum wage back into the bill. Of course, he could not get the 60 votes. In fact, he could not even get 50 votes. There were only 42 votes in the caucus for bringing the minimum wage bill back into the stimulus bill. Now, since this happened, it has been interpreted by various people as the fact, well, there weren't even 50 votes for the minimum wage bill. But this is distorting the situation. No one knows whether there would have been 50 votes for the whole stimulus package if the minimum wage bill was left in as a part of it. It was a must-pass bill, and it had to get out fast. And if Schumer had not amended the bill, the House bill, before he took it to the Senate floor, the outcome might have been entirely different. We will never know. All we know is what happened. That Biden and Harris backed off, that Bernie backed off, that Schumer got to do the amendment, and then the opposition of Sinema and Manchin to $15 an hour was sustained by 6 other Democrats who decided to vote against bringing the minimum wage back into the bill, I believe, in order to protect the 2 senators who were strongly opposed to it. But that's another factor we'll get into talking about this. Anyway, while Congress's failure to raise the minimum wage dealt a blow to the Fight for 15 movement, advocates say there is still enough momentum behind the issue to build pressure on lawmakers in D.C. to bring a $15 minimum wage back to the table. Activists also say the Democratic Party risks losing the support of some of its base if a new minimum wage fails to pass. Quote, it's such a core priority for so many organizations, for so many people, so many of the voters that put a lot of these elected officials into office, unquote, said by Gibras Lassi. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that at all. That looks to me to be an Ethiopian name, but I'm not even certain of that. Director of Work Quality at the National Employment Law Project. And quote again from her, it's the top economic policy priority this year, unquote. The multiple polls have shown there is broad support for a $15 an hour minimum wage. One Pew Research poll from 2019 found that 67% of Americans support a minimum wage increase. An Amazon Ipsos poll released this month found approximately the same percentage of support, even from a poll sponsored by Amazon. With inaction from Congress, 29 states have increased their own minimum wage above the federal rate. Several states have passed laws increasing their minimum wage to $15 an hour gradually. Florida being the most recent state to pass the measure by a ballot initiative. There are a few companies that have also taken things into their own hands, with Costco, Amazon, and Target increasing their minimum wage to at least $15 an hour in recent years. The increase in positive public opinion and the adoption of a $15 an hour minimum wage by states and companies are hard-fought achievements for the Fight for 15, but federal legislation would force states and companies who refuse to increase their minimum wage to adapt. In recent weeks, the White House and Democrats in Congress have said they'll continue to push the issue forward, though how the party plans to get bills through the Senate remains unclear. Ron Klain, Biden's chief of staff, said to MSNBC on the 14th of March, quote, "We're in the fight for 15, unquote." Quote again, "We're going back at it to try to find a legislative strategy to get the votes together to pass the minimum wage," unquote, he said. And quote again, "We're going to talk to our allies on Capitol Hill, our allies in the broader fight for 15, and try to figure out how we get the votes." Well, if you've been coming to my live streams, you know my views on that. Chris Coons and Tom Carper, two senators from Delaware, are in Joe Biden's pocket. And Maggie Hassan and Jeanne Shaheen, I think, are also very closely allied, with Joe Biden, and will take marching orders from him. That's 4 of the 8 people right there. I think that Angus King is also very politically close to Joe Biden and the kind of centrism that he represents, and that if pressure were put on Angus King, he would also be there for Joe Biden. So that is 5 out of the 8. There are only 3 remaining. I forget who the 8th was, but Manchin, and Sinema were people who were the most vital, the most vocal in their opposition to the $15 an hour wage. And both have said since that they were willing to have a raise in the minimum wage, actually quite a substantial raise, with Sinema saying it was okay with her to have an immediate raise to $11 an hour, which is actually higher than the initial raise that was specified in the minimum wage bill. Joe Manchin also mentioned something about $11 an hour, as well. So it looks like the prospect would be good for a pretty for a fairly immediate raise to $11 an hour. And Sinema, by the way, even indicated she'd be in for cost of living increases as we go forward. And economists calculated that likely cost of living increases would bring the $11 an hour minimum wage up in 2021, would bring that up to $15 an hour by 2024, which is a year before the minimum wage bill specified its rise to $15 an hour. So it looks like there's opportunity for debate, and compromise here inside the party to get most or all of the $15 an hour for people by 2024. But there was no opportunity to do that. We'll go a little more deeply into why I think there was no opportunity later. But going forward, reports have indicated Democratic senators who pushed for the $15 minimum wage are meeting with their colleagues who voted against it to talk about next steps to increase the minimum wage. So there's an inside game going on to try to compromise and to try to get the $15 an hour, talk about next steps to increase the minimum wage. All the Republicans, of course, and 8 of the Democrats voted against the inclusion of the wage increase in the stimulus bill. Most of the Democratic senators who voted against it voiced concerns over the rushed way the raise was being passed and its potential impact on small businesses and restaurants, but indicated they were open to some kind of increase. Joe Manchin, who was the star holdout, said he supports an increase that is, quote, responsible and reasonable, citing an $11 an hour figure as something he would support. In addition to getting all the party senators on the same page, Democrats will either have to overrule the parliamentarian, who in February ruled that a wage increase cannot be included in a bill passed with a simple majority, or get support from at least Republican senators to pass the bill. I have to make one thing clear here. The Senate, but parliamentarian, doesn't make a ruling in the Senate. He or she gives advice to the senators on whether a bill being entertained is in violation of the Byrd Rule or not. That's what she does. She gives advice. It's not a question of overruling the parliamentarian. What it is it's a question, of denying the point of order by someone in opposition to the minimum wage, who cites in support of his opinion on the point of order the advice of the parliamentarian. But the basic point here is there's no need to overrule the parliamentarian, because the parliamentarian makes no rules in the first place. That's very important. So the framing is a little funny with this particular article. Support to overrule the parliamentarian as the stimulus bill went through Congress was weak, with Biden saying that he was, quote, disappointed, unquote, in the decision, but that he would respect it. I've said from the beginning, what that means is ambiguous. He can say he respects the parliamentarian and her ruling all day long. He can still have Harris vote against it, because, as I said, the parliamentarian makes no rules. Another way to bypass the parliamentarian's ruling would be if Democrats agree to do away with the filibuster, which would allow them to pass legislation with a simple majority. Well, I would not call that a bypass of the parliamentarian's ruling. I would call it a repeal of the Byrd Rule and a repeal of the filibuster all at the same time. So it would just make the parliamentarian's ruling just irrelevant. But anyway, the legislation protecting voting rights has recently shed a more prominent spotlight on the debate over the filibuster, though some Democrats have voiced hesitancy over getting rid of the procedure. Yeah, the usual suspects: Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema. Meanwhile, some of the moderate Republicans have come out with minimum wage increase plans of their own, showing there is some support for an increase as the party tries to appeal to more working class voters, though they are scaled back compared to what the progressive Democrats want. There's Senator Romney and Tom Cotton, who would increase the minimum wage to $10 an hour by 2025 and include a crackdown on employers hiring undocumented workers. Oh, they love that, don't they? Crack down on the undocumented workers, but not, this is a crackdown on employers. So that is a little different. Also, another plan from Republican Senator Josh Hawley would increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour for corporations who make more than $1 billion a year. It's reported, by the way, that Bernie was never in favor of that because too few workers would be covered by that, and he intends to get the full bill for workers. Though it appears compromise could be made on an increased minimum wage that's lower than 15. It seems as though the progressive Democrats and advocates for a $15 an hour minimum wage are refusing to budge to anything below that. For good reason, because if the minimum wage had kept pace with cost of living and productivity increases, by this time, people would be in line for a minimum wage increase to $24 an hour. there aren't many parts of the United States where $15 an hour is now a living wage. Anyway, progressive House Democrats, in an attempt to pressure their colleagues in the Senate to take on the $15 an hour minimum wage, have started to renew demands for legislation. On a recent call with the press, a dozen House Democrats, labor leaders, and activists demanded that a $15 wage increase be passed by the end of the year. Ro Khanna, who organized the call, said the Democrats can include an increase in must-pass legislation, such as the annual defense spending bill. In other words, wrap it into the defense spending bill as a provision, and then dare anybody to vote against the defense spending bill and have all those ads run in their state showing that they voted against the defense spending bill. That's a typical tactic. If Ro Khanna can get it into the annual defense spending bill, however, that would probably be a minor miracle. Khanna, along with other progressive Democrats, have also advocated for overturning the parliamentarian to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, if it comes to it. So again, the framing, overturning the parliamentarian. What does overturning the parliamentarian mean, actually? Going on. We're making the case now that we've got to be prepared to overturn the parliamentarian if it comes to that, and that we have to get it done, Ro Khanna said. Quote again, this time we realize that we have to mobilize to make this clear months in advance, so it's not like we're doing this a week before the parliamentarian decision or right when the parliamentarian rules. Actually, Ro, what you have to be ready to do is to make it clear that parliamentarian or not, if the minimum wage is not kept in the bill and brought to a vote in the Senate, on the whole bill the minimum wage is wrapped into, that you and the other progressives will vote against that bill and prevent its passage, and will call for a conference committee with the Senate to iron out differences between the House and Senate versions. That's what you have to make clear, that no bill gets through the House unless the minimum wage is in it. You have to pass the bill with the minimum wage in it, and then you have to make clear to the Senate, don't you dare take it out, or we're going to have a conference committee, because we're not voting for this without the minimum wage in it. Khanna said the number of groups on the call demonstrates the widespread support for a $15 an hour minimum wage in the Democratic Party. And Rose said, quote, there could be a real disappointment if we don't get it this time. Khanna said, quote, the Democratic Party is unified around this in the House and among the groups, and candidly among the people who helped us to win the election. So, then he should be making it clear there's not going to be a disappointment if we don't get it this time, unless that disappointment is shared with everybody else, because this next bill doesn't get through unless the minimum wage is in it. It doesn't get past us. So let's keep that clear. Now, you don't get a chance this time just to disappoint us and not to disappoint everybody else. You're going to have to disappoint everybody equally. Anyway, it looks like maybe Chuck Schumer hasn't given up, or maybe it's all kabuki. Here is Chuck. This article appeared on March 29th in the week. It's a staff article. Short, it says a few key Senate Democrats don't appear willing to end the legislative filibuster, leaving most of President Biden's priorities at the far edge of probability. But Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, thinks he may have found, quote, a magical parliamentary trick, unquote, to get Democrats at least one more legislative win in the 50-50 Senates. The Political reports. It involves budget reconciliation and an obscure section of the 1974 Congressional Budget Act. Quote, if you know one thing about the arcane subject of budget reconciliation, it's that it can be used to pass bills through the Senate with just 51 votes, unquote. And, quote again, if you know two things, it's the simple majority rule and that the reconciliation can be used only once every fiscal year, unquote. Politico explains. Now, that's not strictly true. Okay. The reason why it's not strictly true is because three things are possible for inclusion in reconciliation bills. Things related to taxation, things related to spending, and things related to the national debt. So, it is possible to separate those things out, not have them in the same bill. And then you can get up to 3 bills in a fiscal year, 3 separate bills, one dealing with spending, one dealing with taxation, with revenue, as they call it, and one dealing with the national debt. That can be pretty important because that means you can get rid of the debt limit using reconciliation, needing only 51 votes to do that. That can be very, very useful. It can stop debt ceiling crises from ever happening again. Anyway, I digress. Democrats passed their $1.9 trillion stimulus package through the unused fiscal 21 budget, which is to say that the Republicans never used by reconciliation in the part of fiscal 2021 when they controlled the Senate. They couldn't get a reconciliation bill through. So that means in October, November, December, they weren't able to get a reconciliation bill through. By the time January rolled around, okay, it was too late. So, the reconciliation bill just passed by the Democrats, okay, which, by the way, was unrelated to revenue. It was a spending bill, unrelated to revenue, and it was unrelated to also to debt matters. So it covered only one thing, which was spending. Okay, that spending was for the 2021 fiscal year. So Democrats could still pass bills under reconciliation that involved taxation. And they could still pass bills that involved changes to the debt ceiling, okay, or other aspects of the national debt. Now, these things can be important. They could be important. For example, what if Democrats were to pass extremely high taxation bills or to threaten to pass them by using reconciliation, and basically held the Republicans hostage through those bills, seeking to make a deal such that in return for that, the Republicans would approve the passage of the minimum wage as part of such a reconciliation bill. That sounds a little far-fetched, but I've seen very strange things be done by the Republicans themselves when they wanted something. You can do many strange things here if you're smart enough to figure them out. So anyway, it's possible for the Democrats, the article says, to use reconciliation one more time this year, and he's talking this calendar year now. Actually, the staff is saying one more time this calendar year with the 2022 budget. In other words, they can pass a reconciliation bill this summer that applies to the 2022 budget, which starts on October 1st. So it would still start in this calendar year, but it would be the reconciliation bill for the next fiscal year. That is a spending bill for the next fiscal year. As I say, the debt bills and the revenue bills for both fiscal 2021 and fiscal 2022, are left. There can be a lot of reconciliation bills between now and election time. Some of these reconciliation bills could be very popular. Consider, what if you passed a bill that incorporated very high taxes on the rich? That would be very popular with most of the population. Might not be popular with many donors for the Democratic Party, but it would be very popular with the people and might be very popular going into the 2022 election. They could do that under reconciliation with only 51 votes. Anyway, going further. But if the parliamentarian agrees with Schumer's interpretation of Section 304, did I mention Section 304 before? Yeah. Section 304 is the magical trick. There's a Section 304 of the 1974 budget law, which Chuck Schumer is interpreting in the following way. The Democrats can amend last year's budget, that is the fiscal 2021 budget, to pass more legislation through reconciliation. Actually, the 2021 budget, I forget when that was passed, but if the 2021 budget was passed back in 2020, which I believe it was, if I recall correctly, if this was passed in 2020, and Schumer is right, then he can amend that budget right now to pass more legislation through reconciliation. Axios reports, quote, "It's not clear how many additional reconciliation opportunities this theory would open up, but it would add at least one more shot at sidestepping the filibuster this year alone." That is in fiscal 21 alone. Quote, "No final decision has been made on the legislative strategy," unquote, a Schumer aide said to Axios. Schumer wants to maximize his oppositions to allow Senate Democrats multiple pathways to advance President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. If Democrats do pursue the Section 304 strategy, quote, the parliamentarian will once again be the most powerful person in Washington, Politico reports. That's ridiculous. That framing is ridiculous. The most powerful person in Washington was previously and would be again Joe Biden, because he is in a position to order Kamala Harris to ignore the advice of the parliamentarian when the point of order comes up to exclude the minimum wage or anything else from the reconciliation bill. Quote, it goes without saying that this is a bizarre way to govern. Nobody would design a system like this. Where to pass even popular legislation, senators seek to game a rickety budgeting process, and the most important Hill staffers are now the experts on these arcane rules devised in 1974 for the purpose of deficit reduction. Unquote. And so, I'm sorry, this was written by Peter Weber. Actually, it says at the end, or at least he left a note on this. He is one of their regular columnists. I guess they viewed this as a speed read or something like that. So they only gave the author credit with a note at the end. Okay, so you see, it's magic. Chuck Schumer is creating magic. He never showed anything like this kind of inventiveness before. Being the majority leader of the Senate, must agree with him. He figures he wants to rival Mitch, okay, in his inventiveness. Here's a piece from Ryan Grimm at The Intercept. Chuck Schumer eyes a second shot at raising the minimum wage through reconciliation. Biden also frames this in a funny way. Senate Democrats attempted to include the wage hike in President Joe Biden's COVID-19 relief package, but the Senate parliamentarian ruled it was out of order. No, she didn't get a chance to rule that it was out of order, nor would she ever get such a chance. She advised that it was out of order. All of the Democrats could have decided to say, well, we disagree with her. It is not out of order. Well, he does say here, and Senate Democrats allowed that ruling to stand. Actually, it was Chuck Schumer who allowed that ruling to stand, because what Chuck Schumer did was to amend the bill to take the wage hike out before the bill hit the Senate floor. So then Ryan says, an effort to overturn the ruling, which required 60 votes, garnered just 42. He fails to mention the context, that it was Bernie's effort to overturn the ruling. Okay, he fails to mention that if Schumer had continued on with the minimum wage bill from the House and taken that to the floor, it would have only required 50 votes to pass the package, including the minimum wage bill. So instead of Bernie having to get 60 votes to pass the minimum wage bill, he would have only had to lobby, he and others would only have had to lobby the 8 senators who came in with the 42 votes, okay, in the final analysis. And no one knows whether they would have produced only 42 votes for the whole relief package, including the minimum wage bill. So Ryan, again, like the other author, is giving many of the Democrats a pass on this, and Biden and Harris also a pass. Schumer has suggested to progressive groups there's a glimmer of hope that the parliamentarian would rule differently this time. By the way, you saw something like this on Rising this morning with Ryan Grimm getting interviewed by Crystal and Sager. The new legislation is focused on infrastructure, and setting wages is directly relevant to the budget impact of any infrastructure spending. He didn't say this on the Rising program. If there's even a small chance of it working, he reasoned it's worth the fight. But actually, this point is a very strong one, because if the legislation is focused on infrastructure spending, then having a minimum wage in the bill and setting that minimum wage is directly related to the budget impact of any infrastructure spending that the federal government might be doing, or that the federal government might be contracting out. So the specifics of this bill are such that the parliamentarian would certainly have a tougher time in ruling out of the minimum wage when we're talking about an infrastructure bill. Not only would CBO again come up with a ruling which suggested it did have substantial impact, but it would also be the case that senators and the vice president and the president would be on firmer ground, simply saying, we don't agree with the parliamentarian, on this one, because it's obvious to us that there would be a budgetary impact of changes to the minimum wage. So this is within the purview of a reconciliation bill. So there's more than a small chance that this was work, but let's not frame it as if it's a chance, or if it's a matter of probability, or if it's a matter of gambling. It's not. Does Schumer have the support of the president in doing this, or doesn't he? If he has the support of the president and he has the support of the vice president, then this would certainly not be a waste of time, because their support should include a commitment to deny the point of order when an opponent of the bill comes up making a point of order that the minimum wage part of the bill is out of order, and cites the advice of the parliamentarian. If the parliamentarian gives a negative ruling again, the commitment of Biden and Harris and the other senators to vote for the bill anyway, taken as a whole, that's important. Does Schumer have commitments from the relevant people? He may not have commitments from Manchin or from Sinema yet. Does he have commitments from Angus King? Does he have commitments from the Delaware senators? Does he have commitments from the New Hampshire senators? Does he have commitments from Joe Biden and Harris? Schumer, though, is encountering resistance from some backers of increasing the minimum wage, who argue that attempting to include it is doomed to fail, just as it did last time. And in the process, it will trigger another wave of indignation from the public at the failure. Debate over, but the public is already indignant about the failure the first time around. Biden made the promise of $15 an hour minimum wage. He ran. It was one of the few things he ran on that was substantive. Debate over the $1.9 trillion relief package was consumed in its final days by anger over the lack of inclusion of the wage hike, with pressure on progressives to vote it down. And you can believe there would be the same pressure on the progressives, if not more, this time around, because that first stimulus bill was a must-pass bill with eviction moratoriums hanging out, with unemployment help for people hanging out, with people needing more stimulus checks hanging out, with all those things hanging out on this bill. The progressives in the House were not willing to insist on the minimum wage because, in their words, there were so many other good things in this bill, so much that was needed, that they didn't believe that they could take a strong stand. Biden, for his part, he thought the bill was a must-pass, and he thought it was a must-pass quickly. They were approaching the deadline of March 15th when unemployment would be over. They were approaching the end of March when the eviction moratorium would be over. Biden needed that bill to be passed. He needed it from the presidential popularity point of view, too. He didn't want to take another 2 weeks of wrangling and haggling among the Democrats on that bill. He wanted it passed in a hurry. He needed it passed in a hurry. Maybe that's why he said, why he signaled that he wasn't going to fight with the parliamentarian over this, that he wasn't going to fight with Manchin over this, that he wasn't going to fight with Sinema over this. Maybe he had no stomach for a fight with respect to the first bill, but maybe with respect to the infrastructure bill, which would be a bill going into effect for fiscal 2022, maybe with respect to that bill, where they're starting to fight about it just now, and will be fighting also during the summer, there's not such a rush to pass that bill because people will still be living on the sugar high of the first bill. So he can work. He has more time. There's more time for the fighting, more time for the bargaining, more time for the haggling, more time for finding a way to compromise the various interests. If that's the case, there's no telling whether he'd take the same attitude towards the parliamentarian over the bill. He might not do the same thing at all. Nobody is mentioning the difference in the political situation now. The $1.9 trillion bill is currently considered a big success by the American people. Biden's approval ratings are up at 60%. Before the bill was passed, his approval ratings were not that high. He hadn't gained any social credit yet. He hadn't really delivered anything for the American people. Not only that, he had promised immediate stimulus checks. Instead, he runs into the need to go through a reconciliation bill. 2 months of nonsense to pass something where he couldn't get checks to people for that period of time. So, he wanted that bill passed in a hurry, passed by the 15th of March. That timing was very important to him. Now the situation is different. The timing is not so urgent. His popularity is higher. He has more time to work. It is a different political situation than it was just a month ago. Nobody commenting on this is recognizing that. Internal congressional critics of the Schumer idea argue the link between the policy and whether it clears reconciliation is irrelevant. After all, the Republicans included drilling in the Arctic in Trump's tax cut legislation. Two policies nothing to do with each other, and that the parliamentarian is likely to rule the same way again. Taking another run at it, for some in the Senate recalls a favorite maxim of Senator McConnell, who would often say, quote, "There's no education in the second kick of a mule." Quote, right. So don't take the kick the kick of the mule. If you have any doubts about the way the parliamentarian is going to rule, and if you really think that you're not willing to just to say, to hell with you, parliamentarian, if you don't want to have the public opinion problem of doing that, I don't see it as a public opinion problem, because who among the people cares about the freaking parliamentarian? But if you care about that, what you can do right now is you can give the parliamentarian sub rosa 60 days notice or 30 days notice and ask for her resignation right now. Then you can get a parliamentarian in place who will be much more pliable. Specifically, a parliamentarian of Schumer's own choosing. Sources familiar with Schumer's thinking say that he is buoyed by the fact that the parliamentarian's ruling was just one line long, meaning it didn't offer any analysis that could be read as a precedent. Well, I don't want to emphasize that too much, because I think that's just inside baseball bullshit. Okay. But evidently he puts some weight on that. So if he wants to put some weight on that, that's fine. The point being that the parliamentarian's analysis of the question is one line long, rankled some Senate Democrats, given that the parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonough is a staffer, and her role is supposed to be advisory. Do tell advisory. No advice was given. Just, it can't be included in the bill. I mean, that's not advice. You're supposed to explain why when you're advising. When you're advising and you take an advisory role, any consultant knows you explain the situation to the decision maker and you provide your best advice, and then they make the decision. It would be as if a president asked for an analysis on whether waterboarding was within the executive authority, and the legal counsel responded with a one-line memo, either up or down. Putting the minimum wage question back to McDonough might force a more serious grappling with it, or it could result in a copy and pasting of the original rejection. Which, by the way, if that's what happens, that's a pretty good reason for simply overlooking the advice of the parliamentarian. In other words, if Harris decided to ignore the point of order made by the opposition to the minimum wage bill being included in the infrastructure bill, all she would have to say in responding to it, look, is, the parliamentarian gave us a one-line response. I mean, that's not advice. She thinks it's just an opinion. It's an unsupported opinion. She's an advisor. She's supposed to explain. She's supposed to explain why her opinion is grounded in anything. That in itself would be a great rationale for just saying, well, I didn't listen to the parliamentarian because she didn't really give advice. She didn't really explain why she thought the way she thought. I have a mind too, and I'm a decision maker, and my mind tells me that the minimum wage concerns are perfectly relevant when it comes to budgetary impact. So it is included in the bill. And I'm voting against the point of order. And now we're going to the floor vote. and I'm going to be the 51st vote in favor of the total package. That's all that has to happen. The idea is also to continue pushing on all fronts, filibuster reform, and a series of new reconciliation bills until the party finds a soft spot in the line to push a higher minimum wage through. Now that part is good. That part is good. Along those lines, a Schumer aide said the majority leader is also arguing there are opportunities within Senate rules for additional reconciliation bills beyond those that had been expected. And then it brings in Section 304. And it brings up Schumer pushing for multiple rounds of reconciliation, which would also perhaps be strengthening the case for reform of the filibuster by once again establishing the 50-vote threshold as a standard way of passing major pieces of legislation. Once it becomes a standard for the Senate to make decisions with a majority vote rather than 60 votes, it becomes harder to justify maintaining the current rules for some legislation, but not for other pieces. And the cumbersome reconciliation process would feel pressure under the weight of its own absurdity. At the same time, the creative exploration of new procedural maneuvers worries backers of the fight against the filibuster that the party leadership lacks confidence in the ability to get it done. Party still needs to lock down 50 votes in support of hiking the minimum wage. Of course, that's important. And most are assumed to be gettable in a clean vote, though doing so could mean giving ground on the minimum wage for tip workers. That's a key priority of the National Restaurant Association. That would still leave Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. But there is hope that a package of small business tax credits, which would subsidize the wage increase, could get them there. There's more than hope. That could get them there. There is also talk of including the measure in other must-pass passes of legislation, creating a process where there wouldn't be a standalone vote on the minimum wage, but rather on the entire package, Senate sources say. They seem to be considering fighting for it because they're maneuvering around for different things to do. And that is a good sign that they haven't given up the fight and trying to deliver on Biden's promise, on Biden's campaign promise. That must mean they're getting some pressure from the White House about it as well. And all this also must mean that they're recognizing pressure from the people, and they're recognizing that that pressure may be very relevant for the 2022 congressional elections. By the way, in this context, everybody has to recognize with Republican voter suppression bills going forward all over the country, the pressure continues to increase for Democrats to get rid of the filibuster anyway. And if they're going to have to get rid of it anyway to pass H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 and H.R. 51 and H.R. 52 and the corresponding Senate bills, they might as well get rid of it for the minimum wage as well, because you might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. To avail myself of an old cliche. So next, there's a progressive country still to be heard from, another progressive country, and that is in the form of this article from yesterday by Common Dreams from Jessica Corbett. As Biden prepares to unveil the infrastructure plan, progressives push $10 trillion investment. And there's Ed Markey and Chuck Schumer, okay, and a little lady there in the picture And a sign Markey is holding up, "Back the Thrive Agenda." 1-year-old Dara Fares walks across the floor in front of the podium as Senator Ed Markey speaks at the Back the Thrive Agenda press conference on September 10th, 2020. Congressional progressives on Monday officially announced their proposal to invest $10 trillion over the next decade in renewable energy, green buildings, and environmental justice initiatives, while creating over 15 million well-paying union jobs. Yes. Building on the introduction last September of a resolution, quote, by recognizing the duty of the federal government to implement an agenda to transform, heal, and renew by investing in a vibrant economy, thrive, unquote. Key Democrats have joined with climate, labor, racial justice, and other groups to push for the major investment. And the bill lays out a plan for massive job creation within the United States so that a younger generation of Americans can think of these jobs as careers. And Markey, who led the Green New Deal resolution with AOC in February 2019, participated in a press conference on Monday to discuss the proposal. During the event, he declared that, quote, "In order to survive, we need everyone, especially frontline communities and communities of color, to thrive." And Representative Debbie Dingell, another lead sponsor of the Thrive Act, emphasized the need to rebuild our country's economy with a focus on justice and healing. The other lead sponsors are Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, Democrats Ilhan Omar, Jamal Bowman, Pramila Jayapal, Earl Blumenauer, Ro Khanna, Yvette Clarke, and Nanette Barragan of California, according to the Green New Deal Network, a coalition of advocacy groups and the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, which helped craft the proposal. The SEIU is very mainstream inside of the Democratic Party. So they're pushing Biden for a $10 trillion, decade-long green infrastructure program. Half of the bill's spending would go towards communities most impacted by the fossil fuel industry. HuffPost reported on Sunday. The bill would establish a goal of 100% zero carbon electricity by 2035, zero emissions from new buildings by 2025, and extending clean public transit options to a majority of Americans by 2030, and would mandate Congress direct much of its spending towards those aims. That's a quote from the HuffPost article. And the youth-led Sunrise Movement, key backer of the Green New Deal, put out a statement Monday in which Press Secretary Ellen Cialis expressed solidarity with the Thrive Act. She had something interesting to say, so I'll quote it. Quote, "Biden has a historic opportunity in front of him to pass an FDR-style infrastructure package that jumpstarts our economies to support working people, create good jobs, and combat climate change. And there's too much at stake for him to squander it," she said. "If Biden is serious about building back better, he must act on the climate mandate he was elected on and invest at least $1 trillion per year over the next decade to meet the scale and urgency of the crisis we face. In the last year of World War II, America spent 40% of our GDP in 1 year on the war, equivalent to $8.5 trillion in 2021 alone. That is true. The task of transforming our economy and rescuing our planet from the brink of collapse are just as existential to our country now as the war effort was then, unquote. Absolutely correct. She called a $10 trillion investment over 10 years, quote, the minimum, unquote, of what is needed now. And notice that Congress recently passed the president's COVID-19 relief package without Republican support. She said, quote, Biden must build on his momentum and deliver a groundbreaking infrastructure package that puts people to work in the national interest and halts the climate crisis no matter what. If Republicans don't want to get on board, he must do without them. If the filibuster gets in the way of passing what's needed, Senate Democrats must abolish it, unquote. First part of Biden's plan is expected to focus on physical infrastructure, from bridges and ports to railways and water systems, as well as clean energy, electric vehicles, manufacturing and research and development, according to the Post and other outlets. Part 2, set to be unveiled in April, will reportedly focus on childcare, health care, and paid leave, and other provisions. To address the costs, the White House is considering various tax hikes on wealthy individuals and corporations. Of course, a lot of bargaining is going to go into those tax hikes. If they incorporate tax hikes into this proposal, that's going to exhaust 2 reconciliation bills. That is to say, if both the taxes and the spending get into this next reconciliation bills, then they wouldn't be able to pass a separate taxing bill later on, unless that Rule 304 works for them and they can go back to the previous budget. Reporting early last week that the Biden administration was planning to only propose a $3 trillion investment for the full package was met with disappointment. Critics, including Cialis, pointed out that even Joe Manchin has called for up to $4 trillion in such spending. I think he called for $4 trillion over something like 4 years. He wasn't even talking about a decade. I seem to remember Biden on the campaign trail talking about something like $4 trillion over 4 years, and myself saying at the time that wasn't enough, that it had to be more like Bernie Sanders, $16 trillion over 10 years. I think I said $400 billion a year was not enough. Following those reports last week, Sunrise Movement officially launched its Good Jobs for All pledge, calling for legislation that guarantees good jobs for all, invests $10 trillion over the next decade to create millions of union jobs, addressing the crises of climate change, economic equality, and systemic racism, and put money into the hands of people in communities, not the wealthy few, unquote. That's important for another reason. That is to say, if you're launching Good Jobs for All, investing $10 trillion and creating millions of union jobs, guess what? Those million jobs that will be supported by the government spending of $10 trillion are going to be at a living wage, most probably way above the $15 an hour level. That's going to mean that the government is willing to buy labor at a higher level than the $15 per hour. That means people will flock to those jobs, and that it will be difficult for private sector people that want to pay less than $15 per hour to get employees they need. So we might well be talking about a situation where government activity in the green area creates a de facto minimum wage of $15 an hour, or even much better for people. Anyway, the pledge's initial signatory include two Thrive Act leaders, Markey and Bowman, as well as Bernie and Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania, Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey, Adriano Espaillat of New York, Ayanna Pressley, Democrat of Massachusetts, and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan. Sunrise is also supporting the Bill Green Infrastructure and Jobs Act, introduced earlier this month by Markey, Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Warren, and Representative Andy Levin. Andy Levin of Michigan. So, important to emphasize those things. I still have two things that I will go through quickly. But I think you should be getting the big picture by now. That is to say, there are places in the infrastructure effort for the minimum wage to fit, and the minimum wage is still being politically pushed by the Democrats. They seem to be serious about it. They seem to be tying it to the minimum wage and the infrastructure bill or bills. Very popular, okay? But here's Dave Day, and every congressional Democrat gets their own infrastructure bill. This is from today. So guess what? There's the state and local tax deduction, SALT. SALT is getting related to the infrastructure bill because there are Democrats who represent wealthy communities, and the Republicans in 2017 in connection with their own tax cuts for the wealthy, also introduced a limit on state and local tax deductions, which was not of benefit to the wealthy. For a couple, the limits were $10,000 deduction on your taxes. Can't have more than a $10,000 deduction. There didn't used to be any limits for state and local tax deductions. So Dave points out that every politician likes spending money as long as it's spent on something their constituents like. Yes, Republicans hate anything that diminishes their fossil fuel benefactors, but there will also be rural broadband to appeal to some of their members, and plenty of traditional spending and the return of earmarks so that spending can be directed. Everyone likes attending a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The pitfalls with this package will entirely be on the revenue side and to a lesser extent on the process side. So guess what? Don't put any taxes in this reconciliation bill. Save the taxes for a separate reconciliation bill that comes later. Don't make the stupid move of putting taxes in here alone. Make this strictly the 2022 spending bill. On reconciliation, you could pass a separate a separate reconciliation bill on taxes alone. One could even do this. One could do a combined reconciliation bill dealing with taxes and dealing with the debt ceiling. You could repeal the debt ceiling in the context of this separate reconciliation bill, and you could pass some taxes too to make the fiscal responsibility folks feel better. Then the debt ceiling would be off your back for good. No reason to worry about it anymore. And then you could do deficits. You don't have to tax on a one-for-one basis with the cost of the reconciliation bill. I mean, tax about half that amount and have $2 trillion worth of deficit spending. You want to see the economy boom? That's what you do. Centrists are demanding these offsets. So just doing the investment and reaping the rewards down the road is unlikely to be allowable. The taxes are likely to get announced later, but really the four big priorities for the Biden team include increasing the top-line corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%, why are we talking about taxes now? Making the tax on capital gains equal to regular income for the wealthy, and eliminating the step-up in basis so unrealized capital gains aren't wiped out upon death, raising the top marginal tax rate back to 39.6%, where it was in the Obama administration, imposing a global minimum tax on multinational profits obtained from foreign subsidiaries. The Tax Policy Center estimates that gets you $1.6 trillion over 10 years. I'd say do more, get more from the inheritance tax, but that's later. Later, have a separate reconciliation bill on taxing. Take that up in September. Don't touch it until September. Pass the budget bill. Pass the budget bill in July. There are a bunch of other options, including rolling back the Trump tax cuts to estate and partnership taxes. Well, I guess I'm not going to go through that. That's not necessary. Okay, but I want to go to state and local tax deductions. The same deficit hawks pushing for a $350 billion tax giveaway to the wealthy in the form of repealing the $10,000 cap on the state and local tax deduction. That's what you got. You got people like Josh Gottenheimer from New Jersey, who's a Democrat from a wealthy district there, member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, who wants to give away $350 billion in taxes to the wealthy because he's got them in his district. He wants the SALT deduction passed by the Republicans. Passed by the Republicans. He wants the Democrats to repeal that. Financial industry types are successfully pushing Chuck Schumer to repeal the SALT caps. But some House moderates are saying their vote is conditioned on repeal as well. And Speaker Pelosi doesn't have many votes to spare. So there it is. The Problem Solvers Caucus in the House is going to mobilize to try to deny Pelosi a majority. By the way, I don't know if they have enough votes to do that. But I know if they're short a few votes to do that, I know that gives the Progressive Caucus even more leverage. As someone who would directly benefit from restoring SALT, let me say that it's terrible policy, only affecting those who itemize deductions, which is overwhelmingly the very rich. It may seem unfair that only high tax states are hit by this cap, But on the other hand, high-tax states in general have good services, and their electric grid doesn't shut down in cold weather. So I'll take the exchange. We can see David is very patriotic. Well, he talks about what we've already talked about, the loophole in the Budget Act of 1964, allowing the Senate to revisit the prior budget resolutions, enabling a second reconciliation bill for the 2021 fiscal year. Dave says, in general, this is completely absurd to find different ways to use majority rule without taking away the obstacle to majority rule, also known as the filibuster. What makes anyone think Joe Manchin would be against filibuster repeal but for multiple reconciliation packages in a year? I suppose anything's possible. Politicians have a boundless ability to compartmentalize. This is an elaborate way to try to hand-wave around the fundamental issue of a minority veto in the legislature. I know a way to get unlimited reconciliation bills. Let the majority on a vote win. We're in sort of the endless haggling stage of this development, but Biden's speech tomorrow will begin to narrow the contours of the reconciliation bill. That's Biden's speech tomorrow. He's supposedly going to announce what he's going to do in the reconciliation bill. Okay, one more thing. This is from The Week. It's called The Rotten Center of the Infrastructure Debate, and it's from Ryan Cooper. Most of what he says at the beginning. This is reportedly going to be a big package of mostly infrastructure, costing something like $4 trillion over a decade, counterbalanced by $3.5 trillion in tax hikes on the wealthy, aiming to confront global climate change, rebuild the nation's infrastructure, revive domestic manufacturing, transform U.S. child care, among other goals. That's what Jeff Stein of the Washington Post, is saying. That leaves $500 billion in deficit spending for matching those two things. Not near enough for the deficit spending. Joe Manchin has been signaling for weeks now they consider the tax hikes to be an essential part of any package in order to avoid borrowing too much. So that's something to please Joe Manchin. And Representatives Josh Gottheimer of New Jersey and Tom Suozzi, Democrat of New York, not only fretted about the tax hikes, but also demanded a big tax cut for the rich, namely the restoration of the SALT. But you know about that already. We've talked about it. In short, the Democratic moderates are holding climate policy hostage to get a tax cut for the rich. Kick these guys out of the party. The SALT deduction is a good window into the politics of Democratic moderates in blue states. The SALT cap stipulates tax filers can now only deduct $10,000 state and local tax liability. He points out after the Trump tax cut in 2017, now you can only write off $10,000. Going through this in very little detail, this is for the local donor class of these Democrats. They are responding to them. There are a modest number of arguably middle-class people affected by the SALT cap, but even in New Jersey and New York, the vast majority of people hit by this are very comfortable, or better, very comfortable. Moreover, if Democrats want to throw a bone to union pipe fitters in Long Island, or whoever paying huge property tax bills thanks to old homes that have appreciated a lot, they could easily just increase the cap a bit so the top 1% doesn't get the lion's share of the benefit. But Gottheimer and Suozzi want to remove the cap entirely because that's what the local oligarchs want. We also see these moderates not at all serious about making sure the infrastructure bill is paid for. Here we are in a debate that started with them supposedly fretting about the budget deficit, but just like Paul Ryan used to do, their first demand is a huge tax cut, mainly for the stinking rich. It makes for a curious contrast indeed with how many of these same people demanded that coronavirus relief checks be cut down for people making over 75,000 because they didn't, quote, need, unquote, them. Finally, we see once again how moderates don't have a coherent set of policy beliefs. Aside from being a cat's paw for the donor class, they're just expressing the classic moderate neurosis where they nip away at whatever Biden proposes so they can say they scored a win over the left wing of the party, namely making the bill worse for no reason. Peters did not even pretend to argue why 25% would be the right spot, because he probably just picked a number roughly halfway between current law and what Biden suggested. Peters, I'm looking for Peters. Where did Peters come in? Did I miss Peters? I didn't. Oh, Scott Peters of California. Right. He's among this group of problem solvers, so-called. He didn't even pretend to argue that 25% tax increase would be the right spot because he probably just picked a number halfway between current law and what Biden suggested. This shows the wisdom of Biden aiming high. He would be smart to include a few utopian goodies he's willing to trade away. In other words, if he started by proposing a corporate tax rate of 40% and a total marginal income tax rate of 50%, he might get to 28% and 39.6% respective rates that he actually wants, once the moderates extract their pound of flesh, says Ryan. Perhaps moderates can be bought off, the other Ryan, Ryan Cooper, as opposed to Ryan Grimm. Perhaps moderates can be bought off with some combination of earmarks and an increase in the SALT cap. I've noticed Ryan Cooper seems less interested in protecting Biden than Ryan Grimm, okay, of The Intercept. I wonder if there's a lot of pressure going on at The Intercept now for people there to fit into the mainstream, and maybe Ryan Grimm is feeling the pressure. Perhaps moderates can be bought off with some combination of earmarks and an increase in the SALT cap, or perhaps they will bring down the whole thing and end up losing all their seats in 2022, as their blue dog predecessors did in 2010, given how thin the Democratic margins are in both the House and Senate. It is their decision. So he's saying they better pass this infrastructure bill. They better agree to be bought off with some combination of earmarks and an increase in the SALT cap. Because if they bring down the whole thing, they're going to end up losing all their seats in 2022. And guess what? If all you problem solvers go away, who's going to control the Democratic Party in 2023? It's going to be the progressives, because they're the only ones who are going to win. Anyway, just to summarize, you see the tie-ins between the fight for 15 and the infrastructure bill and the arcane rules of the Senate, and how knowledge of these rules is important to getting anything done, and how those who go on Twitter and who make general things like force the vote, very non-specific kinds of things, in order to get things that they don't really understand. Like they don't really understand how those things can be easily defeated. So they get a vote, and the vote, okay, is defeated. And so they say, well, we exposed them. We exposed those who voted against this as not real progressives. Duh. What does that accomplish in 2021 and 2022? What does that accomplish as we run up to the election of 2022? What does it get us for 2023? You have to have a plan. You have to have coordinated pressure from many different sources, including Twitter pressure, but not exclusive through Twitter pressure focused on simple hashtags. It's got to be part of a larger movement and a larger strategy to get something significant passed. And later this week, we'll be talking about that in greater detail, probably on Thursday night, specifically with respect to Medicare for All, either on Thursday, okay, or on Saturday. I'm not sure quite what yet. Going back to your comments, Ghost Start says, howdy. Terry Burke says, glad I was able to join again, learned a lot. Carmen says, invited and shared. Hi, Terry, glad you got my invite. Hi, all. Kay says, share. And vote counting going on now for Alabama Amazon workers. Terry says, here we are still groveling for a living wage when we should be demanding a thriving wage. We're not groveling for a minimum wage. What we're doing is trying to get the minimum wage through, the rise to 15 through in various ways. And then we continue to demand a thriving wage. Ghost Start says, multitasking, Real Progressives March, NOC with Patrick Lovell and Eric Vaughn. Thank you. Lana says Patrick and Eric are great. Lana says, of course, these big companies are doing everything they can to avoid raising the minimum wage. It's unreal, okay, and immoral. It is. They're just as bad as the oligarchs of the 1920s were. They won't give up $1 without a fight. Somehow, it's like King Midas with his gold. It really is. They just want to hang on to all the gold. It's the gold, it's the power, it's the right to push around everybody else. It's about tyranny, people. It's about the appetite for tyranny. Carmen says, that's right, unelect the obstructionists. Carmen says, Sinema may be on her way out. How I'd wish she'd take Joe Manchin with her. Well, she's going to run again unless we take her out in the primary. I'm afraid that might give control of the Senate back to the Republicans. Kay says, Evelina Pont, are you here? We should do everything we can, though, to take her out of the primary. Carmen says employees are getting off easy with just $15 an hour. Employers, you mean, are getting off easy with just $15 an hour. They are, right. Evelina says, hello. Carmen says, employers correction. Evelina says, yeah, that's correct, though, Dr. Joe. They can repeal both, but they are playing stupid, I guess. Evelina says, hey, Steve, you hiding? Come out to play. Laugh out loud. Steve says, just listening in. I'm here to back up Kay. Kay says, thank you, Steve. Steve Wolfbrand says, okay. Or Evelina says, Steve Wolfbrand, okay. Evelina says, disappoint everybody equally. That's brilliant, Dr. Joe. Ah. Terry Burke says, the Three Stooges laugh my ass off. And Carmen says, yep, boomer stuff, Dems play dumb, laugh out loud. Evelina says, three? Three? Yeah, three. You can do one for taxes, one for spending, and one for the national debt each year if you want. You can do three if you separate them. Okay? Or you can do one. You can mix them up and all in one bill if you're stupid enough to do that. Kay says, which someone would teach them MMT? Well, actually, Stephanie seems to be teaching, Stephanie, Pavlina, the Fadl, are teaching more and more people MMT in the House. It's kind of spreading around now, I think. Evelina says, actually, today, I gave someone a very basic lesson, okay, on MMT. Okay, it blew him away. Was he someone in the Congress, Evelina? Kay says, that's great, Evelina. Evelina says it was. Evelina says, Schumer is very shrewd. Schumer can be very shrewd. He hasn't been very shrewd when it comes to resisting Mitch McConnell. He's mostly just caved and folded. Evelina says when he wanted to be, that is, laugh out loud. Evelina says when he wanted to be. Terry says Schumer was never shrewd under fascist Donald. You bet Terry says that. Evelina says agree 100%. Steve Wolfbrand says anyone who wants to trash my friend Kay again will have to go through me first. Carmen says he was too busy romancing them. Evelina says, Kay says, I love you, Steve Wolfbrand. Evelina says, me too. Kay says, go away, Terry Burke. Carmen says, Schumer is trash. Evelyn says, Terry has some good insight into politics as long as it doesn't get personal. Laugh out loud. Evelina says, that's all. Terry says so. Is the $15 an hour going to be featured in the infrastructure bill? By Republicans ain't having that. Well, they're not having the infrastructure bill anyway, are they? In other words, if it's a reconciliation bill for infrastructure, maybe one of them will join up. News broke Lisa Murkowski is going to get a primary challenge from a Trumpist, okay, in Alaska. Lisa Murkowski may be defeated in the Alaskan primary, and she may have to run as an independent again. Regardless, one way or the other, her candidacies will be greatly helped if she votes for the minimum wage bill. It will be greatly helped. And if she pitches in on the infrastructure bill, a lot of money can go to Alaska for the infrastructure bill. Who knows? Maybe the bridge to nowhere can be resurrected so that it becomes a bridge to somewhere. Carmen says, yeah, they've already opposed the infrastructure bill automatically. Mitch may not be able to hold his caucus together. Why would Lisa Murkowski go along with him? Why would she want to go along with him? Evelina says, shake my head. Well, nonsense it is. I mean, Lisa Murkowski's fairly independent anyway. She can get elected in Alaska as an independent. And no better way to prove her independence than supporting the minimum wage bill. I'll tell you. Terry Burke, Carmen, I can see your comments, but those haters can't. I think you blocking them worked. Evelina says, nobody is hating on anybody, Terry. Terry says, 60 days notice sounds great. A pink slip for the parliamentarian. I'm not really for a pink slip, okay, for the parliamentarian. I know I said that. I suggested, maybe that's what they should do. Because I cannot privilege the job of the parliamentarian, okay, against the minimum wage being lifted for everybody in the United States. Okay, I cannot do that. But the point is that nobody had to listen to the parliamentarian. Nobody has to listen to the parliamentarian now. So if they choose to give the parliamentarian her walking papers, it's on them. It's not on me. If I was sitting there and I were in the position of Chuck Schumer, I would have taken that House bill and I would have put it up for a floor vote in the Senate. And I would have let Manchin and Sinema vote against it if they dared. And before they voted against it, of course, someone would have had to have raised a point of order. And I would have let Harris vote for the point of order if she dared. Because I don't think Biden and Harris would have dared to support the parliamentarian if Schumer had put them in that particular position. So I think it's on Schumer too, and it's on Bernie too. Why do I say it's on Bernie too? Because Bernie could have told Schumer he was going to vote against the bill unless it had the minimum wage in it. Terry says, inside passing the buck, incrementalism, as always. Terry says, pure theater by Democrats. Steve Day says, reconcile infrastructure within 15 minutes. Evelina said, giving them another chance, hopeful. Steve Day says, 2021, 2022 fiscal year. No, there's a 2022 fiscal year and a 2021 fiscal year and a 2020 fiscal year. It's just that the 2021 fiscal year starts in October of 2021 because fiscal years and calendar years are not the same. Terry Burke says that's good because the Republicans damn sure aren't giving up and obstructing. Evelyn says they've got to do better than 14 million union jobs over the next decade. I think they said 15 million, but they've got to do better than 15 million too. They've got to do something like 25 million union jobs over the next decade, or 30 million union jobs over the next decade. Kay says, I heard I might be getting my stimulus week. We'll see. Yeah, there was an announcement from the IRS today saying that the stimulus payments would be going out by April 7th. Okay, by April 7th. They said something about they would have them processed by something like the weekend of April 3rd to April 4th, which is this coming weekend, and that they'd be going out on April 7th. So Social Security recipients may well be getting their stimulus payments around April 7th or so. They should have all our banking information from Social Security. Evelina says, but they've got the right idea with the Thrive Act. Evelina says, yay, well, that's the progressives. Carmen says, Dr. Joe, do you think Biden will fire those that obstructed the SS recipients from getting their rescue funds expeditiously? I do. I don't know how long it's going to take him, but I think he's going to fire them, yes. He's getting too much pressure to fire them. There's a lot of left pressure from interest groups defending Social Security who are just spreading the news that he's got to fire them, and who have pointed out, rightly so, that they held up these checks by 4 weeks. They will have held up the checks by close to 4 weeks by the time those checks get to people. If he allows them to get away with that, it's just, he's no president. That's Thrive was called Bill Green by them last week. Carmen says, interesting. Terry says, I want to see how Biden's going to build back better with COVID shooting up again. Yeah, I noticed that too. Certainly is shooting up. I also noticed, though, that generally speaking, almost everybody across the United States is going to be eligible for the vaccine, for some vaccine, by April 15th. And presumably supplies will be up But by then, I believe we're now running at 3 million vaccinations a day. Of course, once you take the vaccination, for 10 days, there's no improvement in protection at all. You have to go through the first 10 days being very, very careful because you'll be just as susceptible as before. So you cannot relax. Even after the 10 days, you don't get the full peak, okay, of protection for up to 30 days. Steve Day says, no check yet. Social Security, retired / a VA disability. Evelina says, climate will be worse than COVID. Yes, it will. Kay says, climate will bring more pandemics. Evelina says, yep. COVID has the CDC lady crying on TV. I don't think COVID is killing the trees. Steve Day says, competition in the labor pool, hashtag federal job guarantee. Steve Wolfbrand says, troll. Who's a troll? Terry says, Steve Wolfbrand, but you're the one trolling me. You love poking the bear and then point your finger at others. Come on, guys, let's not get into a fight again. Terry Burke, the trees are only partial in the larger picture. Carmen says, Carmen, I see what you're talking about. I'm probably not going to follow here again. Carmen says, Carmen, I see what you're talking about. I'm probably not going to follow here again. I don't understand that. L. Stephen Day says, tear out the debt ceiling. Evelyn says, we need climate-resistant infrastructure, more technology to fight disease, and politics with a real public purpose, solidarity, and commitment to global incentives. Yes, we do. Terry says, we need a nationwide lockdown and the ABC bill to be passed. Yes, we do. Evelina says, Terry Burke, agree. Kay says, I hope that more progressives win. If we lock down for 3 weeks, and we did it in New Zealand, following that, and we had the vaccine going on too, we could bring this pandemic to its knees. We could really knock it out. But there's no appetite in Congress and no appetite, in the executive branch to do anything so drastic. If there are any lockdowns, they'll be limited to local areas where there is community spread. Evelina says, Terry Burke, agree. Kay says, I hope that more progressives win. Evelina says, have to, otherwise we're doomed. Kay says, yes, Evelina, I know. Carmen says, yes, we have to watch the progressives all the time. They're the wolves in sheep's clothing. Lana says, thank you for bringing up the Twitter light effect on any of this. People need to understand how it works. We're going to give them some examples of how it works, but later on in the week. Kay says, just heard my niece had a stroke. Shake my head. Oh, that's terrible. Steve Wolfbrand says, you're being stupid, Joe. Force the vote shows who's with us and who's not with us. No. Force the vote has to go on within the context of a plan to do the best we can in any given situation, Steve. Okay. In other words, they're not going to be ready for force the vote, on Medicare for all unless there's a movement coming through all the ways we can exert pressure. It's not about trying to force the vote through Twitter. Let's say, Steve, that force the vote had been successful, and the squad was convinced to withhold votes from Nancy Pelosi unless she agreed to give them a floor vote. And let's say she said, okay, I'll give you a floor vote. And they said, okay, Nancy, we'll vote for you to be Speaker. And she became the Speaker. And she decided to schedule a floor vote for the end of January, let's say, okay, for Medicare for All. Before the new Medicare for All bill was introduced into the Congress by Jayapal. I mean, she couldn't have had a vote then. There was no Medicare for All bill introduced into the Congress, Steve. Let's say Jayapal then introduced that bill into the Congress when she was ready, which was like 2 weeks ago. So let's say Nancy Pelosi said, we're scheduling this for the day after. It wouldn't have won on the day after. It wouldn't have shown who was with us and who's not with us. I mean, maybe it would have shown that for the day after. But what do you expect from the day after? You got 112 co-sponsors. At most, you would have gotten 112 votes the day after it was introduced. You wouldn't have gotten any new information. Maybe a few others would have joined up so that you would have gotten 140 votes for that. Does that mean that the other members of the caucus wouldn't be for it with the proper preparation, the proper movement behind it, all the interest groups behind it, everybody organized in a national media campaign for it? No, it doesn't mean anything. There's a strategy going on to get ready for a Medicare for All vote. It involves the work in committees, hearings now in 2 committees coming up in the House, the mobilization of the nurses, the mobilization of other unions in support, the mobilization of hundreds of interest groups across the country in back of H.R. 1976. Everything's going to be coordinated. Everything is going to peak, including a Force the Vote Twitter campaign at the proper time. But guess what? When it happens, Steve, who's going to be the Speaker of the House? Who's going to be the whip? Who's going to be the number 2 in the House? Who's going to be the head of the Democratic caucus in the House? Nancy Pelosi is going to be the Speaker. But the majority leader is going to be Steny Hoyer. The whip is going to be Jim Clyburn. The chairperson of the caucus is going to be Hakeem Jeffries. Guess what? Every one of the leadership is opposed to Medicare for All. They would all vote against it. You won't get them to vote for it. So what do you need, Steve Wolfbrand? Mr. Brightness, what do you need? What you needed was a different speaker. You needed a different speaker. You were doing the wrong thing on January 3rd. You needed to force the vote to replace Pelosi on January 3rd with somebody else. So you had a friendly speaker with a friendly leadership team to get a good vote for Medicare for All later on in the year. Somebody like Debbie Dingell, who was the lead co-sponsor, helped to write H.R. 1976, helped Budgetary to write it, who's attached to Medicare for All through her family. Her late husband worked for Medicare for All his whole life. Her father-in-law worked on social safety net problems, beginning with Social Security, for his whole life. She came into the Congress as her husband's successor, dedicated to getting Medicare for All for him, for his memory. But she was someone at the center of the party, also popular with the progressives, a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus too. Wouldn't it have been great to have voted against Pelosi and gotten Debbie Dingell as a speaker instead? That's what could have been if you idiots had decided to run a force the vote campaign for that, Steve. Lana says, I was listening to Jordan earlier with New York Amazon workers. I realized they hire some people with a minor criminal record. So in a way, they are an employer of last resort. Then they abuse the workers. Hideous. Lana says, go Evelina, learn MMT. Terry says, but why is there a parliamentarian in the first place? Oh, I think there was a parliamentarian hired sometimes difficult parliamentary questions arise, and you want an expert on Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary procedures to give advice. It's a service. It's a service for the representatives. There's no problem about having a parliamentarian, but the parliamentarian is like one of the economic advisors inside of the administration. Joe Biden doesn't have to take the advice of his economic advisors. He makes his own decisions. And the representatives and senators don't have to take the advice of the parliamentarians. It's advice. It's purely voluntary, whether to sell it or not just purely voluntary. It's the representatives and the senators who bear the responsibility for their decisions. It is not the case. It is not the case that the parliamentarian's advice is in any way binding on an elected official. It is a travesty to suggest that it is. And Gostart says, Kelton, quote, I'm saying that uttering nonsense about, quote, fiscal sustainability, unquote, will undermine their own agenda. We've been down this road before. I'd rather not witness a repeat with the infrastructure bill. I entirely agree with her, of course. I entirely agree with her. Yes, sir, Dr. F, locking down would prevent needless deaths. But locking down with the ABC Act, unbelievable gall, calling the professor and host being stupid. That's all right. He can call me stupid if he wants. Just because I'm a progressive, but just because I'm a professor, I can be stupid. Being stupid doesn't mean that I am stupid. So he can say I'm being stupid. That's perfectly all right. I will argue with him then about who's being stupid. We will see who is being stupid. Because I know who is being stupid. These people still haven't figured out that it was Bernie's folding Bernie's folding on the COVID bill that gave Schumer the opening to write the amended version that got the minimum wage out of the bill. If Bernie had said, hey, Chuck, I'm not voting for this if the minimum wage ain't in it. You solve the problems. Get Joe Manchin, get Sinema on your side with whatever you have to do, but the minimum wage is going nowhere or this bill doesn't get through. Bernie did that. He folded. The progressives in the House folded. They folded in the sense that they wanted that bill to pass on time more than they wanted the minimum wage bill to pass. They had the power to force the minimum wage in. Look, the House progressives even had the power to create a bargaining situation to negotiate a rise in the minimum wage. All they had to do is when they got the bill back from the Senate, they could have voted it down. They could have amended it to pass the minimum wage. All they had to do was vote it down and call for a conference committee. Could have said, the two houses can't come to an agreement. We have to have a conference committee to forge an agreement. Then the two houses could have come together and they could have put back in a minimum wage bill and they could have negotiated the amount and the time frame. You know, they could have negotiated $11 an hour now with step-ups for $15 an hour. You know, there could have been a give and take on something because the original bill incorporated compromise. It wasn't a $15 an hour minimum wage bill right now. It was a $15 an hour minimum wage bill by 2025. Right? There was plenty of room for maneuver. Steve says, Terry is an asshole. Terry says, oh, thanks, Dr. F. Steve says, I never said that. It's all right, Steve, even if you did. I don't mind. I'll argue with you till the cows come home. It's all right. I don't have a thin skin. I don't. And I don't curse at people to get my way either. Like some idiots on the web. I know. Okay. I've done your comments for tonight. Thanks for having a largely but friendly conversation for the most part. I look forward to more friendly conversations in the future. Just remember, I don't mind arguments as long as they don't get personal. Anyway, Steve, I'm glad to see you back. And I hope to see you again in the future. And Terry, I'm real glad to see you too. Carmen, I'm real glad to see you back after being locked out by Facebook forever. And Ghost Start, it's great to see you too. And Ghost Start says, Dems are starting the infrastructure pay-for-us debate with a demand to give $200 billion to the top 1%. It was $350 billion to the top 1%. $350 billion, that's the state and local tax deduction. Steve says, good night. And Ghost Start says, yeah, I read what Ghost Start says it right. Evelina says, you're grand, Dr. Joe. Thank you, Evelina. You're grand, too. Gay says, thank you all for another great discussion. Love you all. Terry says, great insight, Dr. F. Thank you, Terry. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow night. I'll be back tomorrow night.